Oh, yeah.
Excuse me.
Give me that microphone. Sure. Do we have a first question out there? Hadass is going to be passing around the microphone to make sure we hear you. So one in the back, two in the back. We'll run this like an auction.
You talked about functional versus non-functional testing.
Yes.
I was wondering if I could hear some examples of non-functional testing.
Non-functional testing, specifically, for example, post-production monitoring, sir.
Suit production.
Excuse me?
Let's say for production. I'm just not clear on the concept of what we call non-functional.
So from my perspective, when you're looking at the non-functional pieces, you're looking at security, performance, you're looking at accessibility on the device itself, and making sure that it's usable. So the classical non-functional requirements that apply for a traditional web application also extend into the mobile space.
We use functional to mean how the application works, right? Is everything that you've designed as, for the most part, operating correctly? Can I get to my account, can I transfer money, can I do all those things that I want to do on the mobile device? Non-functional, what we're suggesting is things like performance testing. What happens when you add back-end load, right? That's a non-functional test. Ongoing monitoring of your service, available within this framework, but a non-functional test. Having scripts run 24/7 against that test. Those types of things. That's how we make that decision.
Okay, thanks.
Well, there was a second question in the back, sir? Hadass right here.
I had a question about the collecting heuristics you mentioned. You mentioned before that that's at times you're collecting the heuristics from the customers, you're getting information. Are there any tags or how you collect that metadata? How you qualify those heuristics?
Brian, you want to take that?
Sure. Personally, I don't know the exact tool that we're using, but in terms of any contact that happens, we have the capability of being able to detect the type of device that you're on and where you're coming from. So then we can build this analytics database underneath the covers. It's unfortunate it's not in my space, but one of my peers. So they've chosen some of the commercial tools which allow you to do that.
So,
What is some of those analytics databases? Are you using SAP HANA or are you?
No, we're collecting the data ourselves, and then we are going through and we have a BI analytics capability on top of it. So we're mining our own data.
Brett, do you
So
want to add?
something that's kind of related but a little bit different is we also have the ability in the Perfecto Cloud to capture device data and metrics, things like RAM usage, CPU usage, data usage of how much data is the application taking up when someone's using that. That's data that you can capture as part of your test within the cloud. So something similar, but.
Are you saying connect to the IMEI? Is that basically?
So it's basically the system logs and the metrics coming out of the actual device itself.
Was that your question, sir?
So something
I
similar,
didn't know if
but
it was
maybe
coming
not
from that
exactly.
perspective, or for example, some customers are using web trends to interrogate the user agent string to know what devices are hitting the back end. So I don't know what side your question's coming from.
Answer both questions. Yeah, they're both good responses. Thank you.
Terrific. Terrific. Yes, ma'am. Hadass?
You talked about QTP plugin, right? What other plugins does Perfecto Mobile support?
What plugins do we support?
What other
Oh,
plugins?
certainly.
For the functional?
We support in the HTTP suite, let's start there. So there's HP UFT Mobile, just as a brief commercial. HP resells our product and they call it HP UFT Mobile. We offer a plug-in to UFT. We also support, from a performance perspective, Load Runner View Gen. We also support BSM tool. That's within the HP portfolio. From a Microsoft perspective, there's TFS, Team Foundation Server, within the Visual Studio
So
Kim?
Microsoft Test Manager.
So test manager, and I forgot to mention QC, Quality Center from an HP perspective. And then lastly, we have our Rational Quality Manager from IBM's portfolio.
And one thing to add to that, something that's a little bit of a roadmap, but we do have a kind of a 1.0 integration today is Selenium. We are building an integration into Selenium to allow script.
Right, from a look-ahead perspective, and I think from, these are to be announced, so I think that's important to put that into a context. There's Jenkins support as well as Selenium support, which will most likely be announced before end of year. So for those organizations using those platforms. In addition, as the gentleman in the back mentioned SAP, I'll mention Worksoft as a specific. Worksoft is a product essentially for SAP shops going mobile. And so I believe it's an IDE for them. Underneath that, however, I want to make sure that's presented in the appropriate fashion. These are not a series of one-off integrations that we're doing. Rather, we've built the product such that it has an open API. And so against that stable API is how we work with our technology partners. Gartner has pointed out that Perfecto Mobile is in the strongest position of any mobile application testing suite out there as it relates to our integrations. And it's really on the back of that API. And the reason is that we're not trying to do the one-offs, but rather we recognize everybody's already doing it a certain way, and we want to support that. Great. Thank you for your question. Yes, ma'am.
I have two questions. So first about you mentioned babysitting automation.
You wrote that down, don't write the back.
Yeah. So and then that adjective you used, robust automation. So what makes automation robust with respect to perfect mobile? Why should we use the perfect mobile automation tool, and why do you call it robust?
Certainly. I will try to do my best to address that. I also think it's perhaps, before that, start. For example, in your presentation, Brian, you used the phrase continuous unintended testing. That's an achievement that you had.
Right.
Do you want to talk about what that means at USA, and then I can talk about
Sure.
our automation capability?
So for me, when I look at automation is something that's a valuable asset which should run continually. It is a vehicle that you can always have your regression going no matter what's going on. And you're always getting constant feedback. So if I deploy something and it breaks, I can react to it very quickly rather than being late in a cycle. So robust automation not only has to be something that you can schedule and repeat, which means the data that's used in it has to be resettable or recreated so your flows can continue. But also that having the ability to not have one-offs for everything that you're doing. I don't want to have a script for just Android and do the exact same thing for iOS. I want to have the ability to be able to run that script once and execute it on multiple devices. I want to take advantage of reusable components to make things more robust, not only in terms of functionality and flow, but even in environment isolations or environment issues or screen resolutions. For example, looking at, when you look at a device like the Apple and you go from a 4 to a 4S, it increased in resolution. If you're just doing an image-based lookup of trying to say, does this image exist on the 4S? If you use the same image that was on the 4, it would fail because it didn't find it because it's a much better, higher resolution image. So take a step back to make your automation robust is you look and you can create a library, what I call an image library, so I know in this case, I can look and say, this is truly the image, it's on this device, this is what it should be. If I take a step over and look into accessibility, all of my tests should be able to run exactly the same way if I throw the phone into high contrast mode for my visually impaired users. I shouldn't have to reinvent and redo a specific script for that. So that's where I talk about robustness. It's reusability, structuring your code in such a way that you get the same lift in programming as a developer would, whether it's doing Java or anything else.
So yeah, just to add on, and I think Brian hit on a lot of the points. When I think about robustness, really it's kind of two key factors. One is reusability, and number two is resistance to change. So from a reusability standpoint, being able to create a single test case that you can then data drive to run multiple different use cases from a business process standpoint, and talking about using it on different devices, different form factors, different resolutions. So within a single test cycle, being able to create a script and reuse it for multiple purposes. And number two, resistance to change. So when you have a new release, the next version, how much are you changing your script in order to do that? And that's where those script components comes in, within QTP object repositories, being able to reuse single components in multiple scripts, and if you need to make a change, only make that change in one place and have that carry out to all of your scripts. So that's where that kind of robustness and framework comes in.
Yeah, so I have a few more questions, and I really don't want to take us to more technical stuff. But so taking an example of Android, I've seen a lot of tools, they have this playback and record capability, recording playback capability, and then you capture all those properties. And I know that for the Android you can capture index, and that's something that we should not use. So I'm not sure what object.
So yeah, I'll talk about that after during the demonstration.
Right.
So I'll save that conversation
Okay.
for the demo, because I'll show you the various ways we recognize objects.
Right.
So let me, however, take one step back to the larger conversation. Inside of the automation umbrella, you have the object recognition conversation. And from an object recognition conversation, we support 3 different approaches. And we do that because there are limitations and challenges of each. And so we support object properties, be able to do that. We support, from a visual perspective, OCR-based approaches, as well as the DOM object as well. And so, in fact, what we see frequently with some of our customers, this issue where the object might be present, right? But the object is truncated. If it's an object-only approach, it would pass the test, because the object is present on the screen. However, from an end-user experience perspective, the test should fail. And so therefore, we do not have a conversation about which is better. We have a conversation about putting to use both technologies to have a hybrid approach to get you the answer you need. And so therefore, and in addition, resistant to change. Resistance to change, a more brittle approach from an automation perspective as it relates to object recognition, would use your OCR based on XY coordinates, exactly where it is on the screen. We have a more relaxed approach where we can say top half of screen, it should be there. Or whole screen, it should be there. Find it. And so we employ kind of a needle in a haystack approach. So again, these are the mechanisms of the why we would use the word robust, because we're not relying on only one way, but we're trying to capture a set of ways to give you a specific answer.
And I would just comment on doing the record and playback. Personally for me, doing automation for a number of years, record and playback is not something that I'm an advocate of. I know that some organizations do it. But when you're thinking about the speed of change and what's happening in the mobile space, if you have to wait and record and play back your scripts again during every iteration or every release cycle, you're doing that work very late in the cycle, where you want to be able to get your automation going and working as early as possible. So that's why I took the approach of building these function libraries as core components that each team can build upon, and if there's a change, you can change them centrally in one place. You can get a lot of lift quickly by doing record and playback, but on the back-end side, the maintainability and reuse, you really don't get that piece of it, so you lose getting to that robustness of execution of your automation.
And I would also say, just in general, because of your questions, right, is this is where we started in the presentation, is that there's a continuum, and you grow into things, and precisely where Clay ended up with the presentation is that you grow into exploiting some of these mobile unique capabilities, that there's some just new concepts and approaches that are mobile specific. And so, I appreciate from the perspective of how to evaluate which is better, it's also a context of where am I now as well. But did you have a follow-on question?
I have one more question. So, you have also mentioned that there's a support across multiple devices for automation.
Yes.
So that actually spawns two more questions. So one is that, sorry about that.
Hold on, why don't I take the first question before we
Yeah.
move on, which is, we made a claim basically of write once, test many essentially. That if you have an iOS target, and Brett will just actually demonstrate this. If you have an Apple phone next to an Android, can you write one script and will it just work?
Yeah.
The answer is yes, and the how is magic. No. Ignore the man behind the curtain. No, but Brett could demonstrate that. And we could actually talk into it, because it really is about abstraction. From a technical perspective, we abstract the actual device level detail, the manufacturer device level detail, and bubble that up. And that's how we achieve robustness to be able to do that cross device. And that's why we have a patent on the approach, because it's an abstraction method.
Okay. So the second question is, do you support, yeah, I've lost the count of the questions. Do you support mobile device, like a mobile device with Windows platform? Does your automation support automating applications on the Windows, native applications on the Windows platform also? So can I use a tool where I use a mobile device against a Windows platform or a Mac platform? Is there an automation tool that solves that?
Is that?
So, we support Windows Mobile, but are you asking about PC operating systems?
Yeah, so yes, so a device, for example, I have a mobile Android device and there's a target customer which is running on Windows machine. So can I use one tool?
Oh, I see.
So Android to
So
Windows.
that's where kind of that integrations comes in, right? Because there's a lot of tools already in the marketplace that does PC-based testing. QTP, for example, is one of the market leaders in that space, and that's why we plug in, because we're focused on extending existing tools into mobile. We don't want to reinvent the wheel that's already been available. So that's where that plugin comes in, where in a single QTP script, for example, you can execute the first half of the script against the PC, and the same script execute against mobile devices and compare and contrast the results on both. That can be consolidated from those tools' perspective.
Great.
Okay.
Excellent. Follow-on question in the back. Do we have any questions up front before we go again to the back? Let's go to the back. Oh, up front. Sorry.
I'm just wondering how fast and how easy your technology could be adapted. For example, in the example that the gentleman gave, the company used 16 or 18 weeks before they use your automation, and then they end up with 2 days automation. So what's the time? What's the initial time investment between using automation and?
So it's a good question, and I think there are some factors that determine ultimately how long the ramp-up time is going to be. How much experience do you have with automation in general? What kind of tools are you using today? And I can speak from kind of personal experience because I was with HP before joining Perfecto, and I was familiar with the QTP suite of products. It took me maybe a week to get 75%, 80% proficient on the solution, and maybe another 2 to 3 weeks to get up to 90 and 95%. So it's a really, really quick ramp up because of the way that we've designed the automation to plug into the existing tools that you already have. And from our standalone perspective, and I'll show you in the demo, it's really kind of a click and play based on the UI. It's all keyword driven, so there's not really much, you don't have to learn an extensive scripting technology. And the underlying concepts, the constructs, are similar to what you would be using for web-based automation as well. So I would say, if I had to give a time estimate, 2 weeks to get ramped up and initially started, and maybe another, 2 weeks to a month to get fully proficient and take advantage of all the functionality of the full capabilities.
Brian,
Just
do you
as an
remember a
estimate.
time when you guys didn't have Perfecto Mobile? Can you answer the question from that perspective?
I was going to say, yeah, we actually, when we first started, everything we did was manual, which was, very labor intensive to physically have all the devices and go through. And, ultimately we had a different cloud solution, and then we reevaluated and brought in Perfecto, and we started with their script once technique and technology, and then moved into the QTP realm. And really, it was about the skills that we had in the overall organization and a philosophy that was trying to get people to think. So there, to me, for this question, there's really a cultural side of it as well. I challenge the QA organization always to think about what you can do to automate first and move through, as opposed to how do I test this and just do it manually. So as we do that, you start to build these good repository of scripts, of assets that you can then reuse. And so the next time in, it maybe took you the week the first time, the next time in you're doing it in 3 days, the next time after that you're doing it in a day. So I think it compounds itself once you get everybody into that whole methodology and thought process.
If I can also just add to that as well, because we obviously develop a lot of scripts for our customers, and we even come on board and train customers to develop their own scripts as well. But it ultimately comes down to the "it depends" type response, because the enterprise organization already has an idea in terms of the percentage in which they want to automate. You never want to automate 100%, it's impossible, right? Because the cost exceeds the return on investment, as I mentioned. So there is a percentage there, right, between 0 and 100 that we look and work with the large enterprise organizations to kind of find that mix in terms of how much they want to automate. Once they have determined that, then we determine the complexity of the application, the complexity of the environment, the complexity of the actual QA processes as a whole. Are they a well-documented QA organization? Are they loosely documented type organization? And then obviously we look at the resources that the organization has in terms of developing the scripts and executing the scripts and things like that. So it's a huge depends type response.
And that's a good point, because you should look at your automation, just like any test case, it has a lifespan. So you should always be going back, constantly evaluating, are these level of automation, are these scripts still relevant? Are these test cases that they're automating, are they relevant? If they're no longer relevant, then pull them out of your suite and concentrate on the next thing that you want to do so you can keep a certain level of coverage. And that's very key to make sure you're successful, because otherwise what you'll have is you'll have this huge bucket of tests that maybe functionality that you can pull out of your product and hasn't been there for years, and all the tests pass. It's not helping.
Sure.
Right.
Does that answer the question? Terrific. Any other? Please.
So, as you can imagine, bank is thrown on firewall. And I just, in order for you to access our test environment, you have to be on a Chase network, you have to access the VPN. And I would love to use your program just to see guys how can you access our test environment, how can you run our test cases on your devices.
So, you want to?
Yeah, I can take that. I can actually start with this because I get that all the time. In fact, I was meeting with one of your counterparts on this subject just a couple of weeks ago, and I know what you're talking about. We have to do this quite a bit for a lot of large enterprise organizations, because they do have risk and conformance, risk and compliance offices that enforce restrictions that sometimes might seem absolutely impossible to have these type of environments online. We've developed a lab, as I mentioned, in different parts of the world, Phoenix here in North America, that allows the large enterprise organization to meet these extraneous requirements from a physical security and fire perspective, from an IT firewall security, VPN type connectivity perspective, from using even biometrics and limiting the number of individuals that are allowed to go into the lab, swap devices off and on the docking stations, ensuring that the devices are wide, ensuring that if the devices are specific to that one particular customer, that they're not shared with other customers. That's we call that a dedicated cloud environment, and we use a Perfecto tool to set that up for customers that have these very unique specific requirements.
Just as a level set to the conversation, in our customer base, we serve 7 out of the top 10 banks. The issue of security, we have, I think, completely addressed with regards to be able to satisfy, in your specific instance, JPMC requirements, security requirements. So it's not minimizing the high bar that JPMC has set, but it's rather to say that we will meet that high bar. And when you start, I'm sorry, please.
We have resolved that with JPMC. You are a current customer. We passed that test and are deploying our solution for JPMC.
So I would say from our, if you're finished.
Please finish.
From our perspective, we looked at it very, very intently as well, and we had a strong partnership with our security and security counterparts to go through. And in fact, that was one of the driving factors which moved us off of a different cloud provider onto Perfecto, because they were able to meet the requirements that we had. And in terms of wiping, we asked very early on when we first started negotiations almost 3 years ago with Perfecto, yeah, we need that ability to, once we execute, to have the application cleaned up. They went in and they added that functionality, so now every time I run a test suite, I know that I don't have to have my team go back and look and say, did it really remove the application? Did it really remove all the fingerprinting of us being there? It does it, and so, they have the facilities to get you, to where you need to be.
But that's an important question on the back of most customers' minds or prospects' minds as they're moving towards our system. The good news is that we've been able to successfully address the requirements. Welcome. Other questions? So with that, I want to say thank you for your questions. We're going to transition now into a